Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the fourth episode of the story, What If Naruto Was in a Modern World, in which Hinata was barely exposed to Naruto's constant belief in himself. Now in her mid-20s, she meets him again and discovers a crack in her careful wall of Hyuga perfection. To show your support, like and subscribe. Let's get this show going. There was a strange, awkward silence that hung in the air and stung the skin. Naruto closed his eyes and pushed off from the wall while Hinata recovered some of her dignity. Unfortunately, he didn't get very far. Her fingers were still tangled in his shirt, demanding his closeness. It was very clear that she was not ready to let go, and her sudden insecurity surprised him. "Hanabi, what are you doing here?" She barely managed to squeeze out her question. She tugged at Naruto's shirt to stop his retreat. The need to hide herself from her sister's prying eyes was almost overwhelming. Disregarding her unusually shy behavior, he allowed her uncertainty to pull him forward. She pressed his t-shirt against her lips, gripping the fabric into her small fists. His body automatically leaned into hers, making her fingers relax, but she still kept him close. He was her willing hostage. He leaned his chin against her temple and settled his gaze on the younger sibling. "Like I said, you forgot your purse in the car, so." Hanabi purposefully allowed the rest of her sentence to remain unsaid. She then crossed her arms, leaning her weight from one foot to the next. "What's, going on in here?" The smirk betrayed her suggested obliviousness to the situation. It was more than obvious. Unfortunately for the eldest sister, the younger one had the terrible habit of making her uncomfortable for her own amusement. "We were discussing the meaning of flowers," Naruto suggested quite suddenly. Hinata had yet to utter a word in response, and the long pause of silence was getting uncomfortable. "Ah." Hanabi nodded quite seriously, her index wrapped around her chin. "Would I be able to participate in this most informative conversation?" she asked innocently. "Being that I'm your assistant, dear sister, I need to be kept informed of our company's endeavors." She was too clever for her own good. The priceless expression on her sister's face was worth every uncomfortable second she risked being disowned by the heiress. Hinata just stared, still unable to form the words for a coherent sentence to rebuke the question. "How very considerate of you, Miss Hyuga," Naruto voiced, feeling Hinata's fist tighten its grip against his chest, "but I'm afraid this discussion is not open for the participation of third parties." Hanabi sighed, feigning disappointment before they both grinned, becoming instant collaborators in an evil scheme to torture the flabbergasted heiress. A little humph escaped Hinata's lips, and it was then when they realized that their jig was up. She wasn't about to idly stand there and put up with this little farce at her expense. "Thank you for bringing my purse," she mumbled quickly against Naruto's chest, exasperated that she couldn't keep that particular habit under control. In her recent self-discovery, one of the first things Hinata learned was that stuttering had plagued her since childhood, and, by the looks of it, this inconvenient habit was making a strong comeback, determined to humiliate her at the most inopportune moments. Ignoring Naruto's chuckle at her slip, she tried to get the creeping, fiery blush under control before pressing her palms firmly against his chest and pushing him back lightly. She avoided making eye contact, fearing she would lose all resolve if she dared to look into those blue pools. She felt his hand steady her at the elbow as she made every attempt to look dignified while walking towards her sister. But her efforts were in vain. Her hair was a complete mess, never mind the fact that part of her shirt was untucked. Hanabi burst out laughing, hard and without restraint, while pointing at her own blouse. Hinata's gaze landed on the white trim of her blouse, and, to her dismay, she found two undone buttons. Hinata narrowed her eyes and looked accusingly at the instigator. He only chuckled sheepishly, shrugging in feigned innocence. She evenly divided the time she spent glaring at them, tucking in her shirt and grumbling threats under her breath. Naruto tried to not smile by pressing his lips together, but it didn't help him any. Quite the contrary, actually. His attempts at playing it innocent, not to mention the mischievous glint in his eyes, made him look horrendously guilty. Hinata felt a little frazzled. When did he get the chance to unbutton her blouse, let alone untuck it? She didn't even realize he had touched her there. And thus, Hinata decided that he was dangerous to her senses. As soon as he invaded her personal space, her sensibility blurred and the world around her disappeared, fading until he was the only thing that remained. Her brows pinched in a frown and there was a change in her step as she nearly stomped toward her sister. She snatched the purse from Hanabi's languid fingers and huffed out a "thank you," before marching right back to Naruto. She still had that particular look on her face and he wondered if he should tactfully retreat to his room and stay there until Konohamaru showed up the next morning. Might be the safest option. He didn't get too far with his plan, however. Hinata had already pushed the ottoman aside, making enough room to let her small figure through, and disappeared behind the bedroom door. He caught her eyes before she dutifully shut herself in with a resounding thunk. He knew that look. He knew it well. He sighed and shook his head. All the women in his life had given him that look at one point or another, but he just didn't expect Hinata to give it to him so soon. Oh, dear. Hanabi, on the other hand, was far from distressed. She wiped at a tear that had escaped while she hysterically laughed at her sister's strange retreat. I think we may have upset her, Naruto. He glanced away from the wood panels of the door and looked at the other woman, scratching behind his right ear absent-mindedly, contemplating how he'd managed to get into the doghouse again. Yeah. As a prankster, he had cleared his mind of all warning bells when he took Hanabi's invitation to participate in the tease. We went too far, I think. No, she assured the blonde, she's mad with me, mostly. That last little bit wasn't missed by him and he groaned. Just as things were finally starting to look up for him, he had to put his foot in his mouth with an idiotic grin. Hanabi took her shoes off and walked towards him, eyes glinting with amusement. She gave me that look, though, he mumbled dejectedly as he pointed at the door, skeptical, and heard a noise behind the wooden panes that resembled something close to an agreement on Hinata's part. Hanabi shrugged and walked past him towards the kitchen. She'll get over it, she's just annoyed, I interrupted. Her voice was muffled by the sound of water and the thick walls that separated them. With Hanabi in the other room, Naruto sighed in relief. Out of nowhere, he was strangely having a very difficult time hiding the flush of his cheeks. He gave the door a longing look and barely knocked on it. His knuckles then dragged slowly down the wood and he frowned slightly. Hinata, he whispered. Her name was quiet in his ears, but he knew she heard him. The door opened, providing a crack large enough for her to shyly look at him. Her fingers wrapped around the door edge and she waited for him to speak. Naruto's breath suddenly hitched. There was something unexpectedly beautiful about the way she was tinged with pink, her eyes shy and her bottom lip abused from her uncertainty. He reached out and let his fingers lightly touch her fingers on the door in comfort. Her gaze followed the movement and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. Naruto couldn't help but think of how warm they were compared to his. There was something soothing about her, he couldn't quite say what exactly, but she calmed him despite his nervousness. It was like the world Hinata was offering him was like water to an unquenchable thirst, and with a sudden fierceness, he couldn't imagine what his life had been without her. When he tried, he discovered that it was boring and tinged with gray. It was then that he realized he couldn't screw this up, he wouldn't allow himself to. I'm sorry about what I just said. I mean it, he whispered, only loud enough for her to hear. His blue eyes had darkened, or maybe it was her imagination. As they swept over her face and she felt a delicious wave of heat wherever they looked. Her heart was beating hard again and she found herself far too aware of him. Focusing on him before nodding, she pulled the door open, widening the space that kept them separated. Naruto was relieved when she moved towards him, glad to know she had forgiven his prank, but her next action left him a little confused. Her fingers wrapped themselves in his, enveloping his skin like velvet. Her small feet stopped between his and tip-toed her body upwards. Hinata kissed him tenderly, and the silky feeling of her lips on his set his Senses on overdrive. He felt her tongue slip slightly between his lips, and, before he could respond properly, she broke the intimate contact, stepping back into her room. She sighed, satisfied, and pressed her fingertips against her mouth. He could see the smile lingering. "I just wanted to know if it really was lemon," she whispered as she started to close her door. "Good night, Naruto." The door clicked shut, and the blonde let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He was dumbstruck. He could only stare as his brain processed the second assault from the petite woman. Lemon? His mind was buzzing with a strange sensation. Oh. His fingers touched his lips, the heat of her kiss lingering, the feel of her tongue still burning his, right, the Skittles. A small hand struck her, and she pushed the offending body part from her face. Hinata sat up, groggy from an uncomfortable night of sleep. She stretched and poked Hanabi, trying to stir her awake. The younger sister swatted her fingers away, a grumbled, "Go away, just 5 more minutes," slurred in Hinata's direction. There was a loud clang of pans that startled her, and she sighed when she realized Hanabi had left the bedroom door open when she crawled into bed with her the night before. Her gaze crossed the hallway and landed in Naruto's room. She figured that he'd probably been up for a while, considering the bed was made and the door was wide open. Hanabi stirred, stealing the blankets from her, mumbling something about letting the cold in, making Hinata shake her head. She stood up from the bed, pulled on a robe, and made her way towards the kitchen where the sounds grew louder. She could hear Naruto speaking, but the specifics were lost in the clanking noises and the sound of rushing water. She peeked around the entrance and watched him. He was filling the tea kettle while speaking on his cell, and suddenly she grew nervous. Her forwardness from the previous night hadn't really sunk in until just now, and, to her misfortune, she couldn't figure out a way to casually greet him without probably making a fool of herself. "Good morning, Hinata." His voice sliced through her inner battle of nerves and indecision, making her look at him, startled. He grinned at her, a light flush on his cheeks. She smiled at him, realizing that he was just as nervous. "You are making tea?" Hanabi strolled in behind her, startling both of them. "Yeah, you mentioned you liked tea." Naruto returned to his phone conversation. Hinata gave her sister a strange look. Hanabi's indifferent response was that of a shrug as she walked past her and sat at the island in the middle of the kitchen. Hinata followed her sister and joined her. She had a few questions for the little troublemaker. Naruto put 2 cups before the sisters and pointed at the coffee, eyeing Hinata in a silent question. She nodded. He poured her a cup, pulled out the tea container from one of the cupboards and placed it by Hanabi. She thanked him before he made his way out of the kitchen to give the girls some privacy and avoid interrupting them with his call. Hinata sipped the warm liquid, wondering what exactly had happened after she had gone to bed. "Why are you still here?" She put down her cup, wrapping her fingers around the porcelain, seeking the warmth. Hanabi glanced at her, busy stirring the tea bag as she let out a strange giggle. "I stayed up for a while with Naruto discussing the contract." She turned her attention towards her eldest sister and smiled. It was an opportune time, since he was awake. Hinata felt another blush creeping up. "Plus, I'm supposed to meet with his associate today." She brought the cup to her lips and took a small sip, discovering the tea to be far too hot. "Naruto suggested I stay here since it was getting quite late and Konohamaru will be meeting me here." "That's the only reason." Hinata eyed her sister suspiciously. Hanabi didn't even bother hiding her mischievous little grin. "Of course. Why do you ask?" Hinata let out this little hum, her eyes narrowing when her sister began to giggle again. When she opened her mouth to call her sly sister on her devious little plan, she heard shuffling sounds coming from the kitchen entrance. "Ah, sorry to interrupt." Naruto flicked his cell shut and dropped it in his shirt pocket. At the sound of keys jingling, Hinata noticed the large rolled-up pieces of paper he held under an arm. "I have to bring these to Kiba for a second opinion and I have to deal with some problems back at the office." "When will Konohamaru arrive?" Hanabi cut in before Hinata could answer him. Naruto's gaze left Hinata and focused on the younger sister. Probably another hour or so, though I'm not sure I'll be back before then. His gaze shifted to Hinata again, and he smiled at her. Well, why don't you walk him to the door, Hinata? Hanabi took another sip of her tea nonchalantly. Hinata almost choked on her coffee. Coughing painfully, she shot the younger Hyuga a dirty look, but her threat was ineffective, since Hanabi was completely ignoring her. Naruto shook his head, chuckling, and walked away from the kitchen. Hinata followed after Naruto, and just as she prepared to give her sister another Thizazantover glare, she was distracted by the feel of his fingers sneaking inside her hand and wrapping themselves around hers. She blinked, feeling his hand tug her along towards the door. She didn't resist, allowing her steps to fall soundlessly next to his. She glanced towards his face, his expression was relaxed, almost sleepy, and as though he could feel her watching he met her gaze, smiling when she blushed lightly. This was more like the girl he remembered. That endearing, everlasting blush that he never understood back then was now a compliment to him. He squeezed her hand lightly before turning towards her when they reached the entrance. "Don't be so nervous around me," he requested in a whisper before she felt his lips on her cheek. "I don't bite too hard." He winked at her and stepped outside. She wasn't quite sure how to react to that, so she did the only thing she discovered she was good at around him, blush and stutter. Her sentence was a jumble that made Naruto bark out a laugh and kiss her cheek again. "I'll be back soon." He waved to her, and shifted his gaze beyond hers. "And you? Don't harass her too much." Hinata heard another onslaught of giggles that made her ears burn. "What a valiant protector," her sister's musical voice drifted down the hall. Hinata turned towards the offending sound, only to see the instigator leaning against the frame of the kitchen entrance, watching her. "Again, why are you still here?" Hanabi didn't answer her, the younger sibling only raised a brow and smirked, watching in amusement as Hinata threw her hands up in the air, sighing in defeat and disappearing into her room to change. She wouldn't have missed this for anything, the transformation was incredible. For once, Hanabi was in complete agreement with her cousin's plans and she had to make sure to give him a full report the next time she saw him. Naruto stepped off the elevator, relieved somewhat to be on familiar grounds, and headed straight towards his office. As much as he liked being at Hinata's, he could get some work done here at a faster rate. He absently wondered where Akamaru was, missing the mutt's usual greeting at the elevator. He pushed the stray thought away when he heard voices. It didn't take long for him to realize that Kiba was speaking with Shikamaru down the hall. The memory of promising to meet with them yesterday fluttered in at the back of his mind, and he repressed the urge to groan. He had entirely forgotten, his mind entirely focused on Hinata and the mess he'd managed to get himself into. It wasn't like him to forget meetings, especially important ones. Worst part of forgetting this particular meeting was the fact that it was a compromised network meeting full of information, jargon and examples he couldn't dream of understanding. Put it in landscape terminology and he was your man, but computers, just the thought of it made him cringe. Kiba hadn't gone into too many details over what happened, but he knew it was something major, considering White Snake had sent a team over almost instantaneously when Kiba hacked off the server lines like a caveman. Can't believe they would go that far. I knew there was more to it than just stealing Naruto's landscaping designs, the security programs are too complex to be used for that purpose. Naruto stopped short of his office and listened in. Something about Shikamaru's monotone voice nearly lulled him to sleep on his feet. Dear God, I'm not gonna make it through this meeting if Shikamaru reports the whole damn thing to me. Mentally preparing himself for the onslaught of sleep-inducing boredom, he was interrupted by a strange squeak he wasn't familiar with, annoyingly grinding on his nerves. That better not be my chair making that sound. He thought irritably before stepping inside the office. He was greeted with the bark of Akamaru and Kiba's feet on his desk. Speaking of the devil. Kiba exclaimed happily when the door to the office busted open and a mop of blonde hair strolled in. He watched Naruto's happy expression slowly turn into a scowl. Kiba felt nervous all of a sudden. Noticing the strange tilt in Kiba's sitting position, Naruto narrowed his eyes, his face pinched oddly. Kiba straightened out, trying to untilt the chair. Fuck. Kiba knew he was eyeballs deep in shit and there was no way around it. About time you showed up. Kiba grinned at him, completely ignoring the threats dripping off his boss. He wanted to defend himself in regards to the chair, but, lucky for him, there were more pressing matters and this wasn't the time. He shrugged when Naruto shot him a what the fuck happened-er glare. Shikamaru sighed, sensing the tension between the two idiots. The bored sigh seemed to have snapped them out of their inner monologue battle, and Naruto motioned for Kiba to get out from behind his desk. Sorry, I got sidetracked. What's going on? I bet you did. Kiba stood up and walked around the desk. The dog lover had that grin again, Naruto noticed, like he knew something the blonde was completely oblivious to. Oh, how he hated that grin. What is that supposed to mean? Naruto was irked, he felt like the butt of some joke. This only made Kiba snicker and pretend he had no idea what Naruto was talking about. Shikamaru shook his head lightly, wondering whatever possessed him to accept this new contract. If you two twiddledums are done, I'd like to get this show on the road. Naruto and Kiba looked at Shikamaru, both of them surprised by the sudden authoritative tone the lazy technician used to bring them back to the topic at hand. They both apologized, but continued to snicker and glare. Now, Shikamaru cut in before Naruto decided to throttle Kiba into a coma for that last hand motion that specifically told Naruto what he thought about his threats. Let's discuss my findings. Naruto placed the blueprints of his tentative designs on his desk before sitting down. The chair moved and tilted, made a high-pitched squeak that indicated something was broken beyond repair. He shot Kiba a glare, but the dog owner only shrugged and ignored the choked snort of anger sputtering out of his boss. What exactly are those findings? Naruto focused on Shikamaru, finally. Surprised by the seriousness, Shikamaru leaned forward, his elbows hitting the top of the desk. He considered the ways he could dumb down the technical terms so that he didn't need to continuously repeat himself. It looks like they're using your network to get to a bigger prize. From what I could see, they're piggybacking through you and doing damage elsewhere. Naruto closed his eyes with dread. He didn't like where this was headed. Do you know where they're attacking? Shikamaru nodded. By the looks of things, and from what I could trace back to them, they're making it seem like your company is breaking into the city's systems and bank accounts. Naruto wasn't sure he heard him quite right and must have asked several times to repeat that last bit. It must have been too much since Kiba had to pick up where Shikamaru left off, repeating it at least half a dozen times more, quite irritably, mind you. What happened next was expected, and Kiba was already prepared. Naruto's reaction to those sorts of things was pretty predictable, after all. What the fuck? This wasn't urgent enough for you to call me directly? He was pissed. No, scratch that. He was beyond pissed. He couldn't believe the level of irresponsibility from his staff. Failing to report this to him immediately was. Arg, he yelled, standing up and throwing his hands up in the air. He was at a loss for words and began to walk like a caged lion. Kiba chuckled and Shikamaru waited for Naruto to calm down before continuing, but he should have known better. Kiba couldn't resist sadistically jabbing at Naruto when he was all worked up like this. Will you calm down for 2 minutes and listen to what he has to say? Kiba barked while Naruto continued to rave, blaring out incoherent insults towards him specifically. The blonde stopped circling and narrowed his glare on the two idiots in his office. You got 2 minutes before I fire both of your asses. Kiba rolled his eyes. How many times did he hear that in the span of a day? We already contacted Tsunade and gave her a heads up on what's going on. Naruto was instantly relieved. The last thing he wanted was to ruin her re-elections with some sort of scandal that not only brought his company to its knees, but dragged Tsunade's name and credibility through the mud. Shikamaru wrote a detailed report with all the evidence necessary to show that it's not really coming from our end, but from White Snake's company. He'll be handing that over to the authorities later on today since Tsunade's already working with them to bring down that company. Kiba kept watching Naruto's expression with a smirk. Apparently, they've been trying to nail them for a couple of years. It had been a while since he had been this entertained. Naruto groaned. There's more, isn't there? He forced himself not to rub his face when both Shikamaru and Kiba exchanged knowing glances. He wasn't going to like this. So. Naruto eyed Kiba, who had turned his attention to the large windows. This was Shikamaru's cue to pick up from there and convince Naruto that the end of the world wasn't about to strike. So, as you suspect, we're not entirely out of the woods, Shikamaru admitted. Meaning? Naruto was getting a little tired of the cryptic answers. He focused on the technician, who leaned back into the chair, his hands crossed behind his head. There's someone else behind that company that's calling the shots, according to the detective we spoke with earlier today. They're just a middleman, unfortunately, from what I could gather. Naruto rubbed his face with both hands, his stress was on a constant rise and he had a feeling things were about to get way more complicated. What do we need to do, then? We've been asked to keep track of White Snake's moves, monitor them so that they can trace it back to whoever is calling the shots. Shikamaru pressed his fingertips to his temples, trying to think of a way to explain it better. Naruto was standing still at least but had this horrible confused look on his face. This is troublesome. Aren't these bastards in breach of our contract? They were only supposed to be technical support and provide full weekly backups of the servers. He looked to Kiba for confirmation, who nodded in agreement. So, why should I continue business with them? I should sue Kabuto's ass for this bullshit. Kiba knew that for the longest time, Naruto had been trying to find a good reason to get rid of them, and now that the opportunity presented itself virtually on a silver platter, he now needed a real good reason to convince him otherwise. Go figure. Kiba gave Shikamaru a pleading look to be a little bit more patient and explain it clearly. Shikamaru sighed. He had one trump card left. Tsunade thinks she knows who it is, but they need more evidence. Kiba almost laughed when Naruto let out a long sigh. He knew the blonde couldn't refuse his godmother, no matter what. So she wants me to continue playing possum? Pretty much, Kiba said. Naruto crumbled on his chair and groaned. Christ, how long are we going to have to put with this? Shikamaru shrugged. Until we can get a more solid evidence for the police. Naruto shot him a heavy-lidded glare. Thank you, Captain Obvious. The sarcasm was purposefully missed by the technician, who merely nodded before continuing. I've set up several hidden codes inside the system to track their activities. At the same time, this will help me figure out how to break into theirs without being detected. He pointed at Naruto's desk, where there was a slim case the blonde apparently hadn't noticed yet. I picked up another computer for you. That, I will be adding to your bill, by the way. It has its own secure network with my firm. Naruto picked it up, opened the case and grinned when he saw the laptop. Your staff will continue to use the network, but you and Kiba will be on a separate one. I'll be uploading dummy files to keep suspicion away, but I would stay away from your computers for now. Naruto nodded, agreeing to the terms set up by Shikamaru. The technician stood up and stretched, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm heading out. Been here 2 days already, and I'm sure my wife is going to start wondering if I've been kidnapped. Kiba laughed, shaking his head. You make it sound like I didn't. Let you leave the office, Shika. You didn't, he deadpanned, which only made Kiba laugh harder. Anyway, give me a call later if anything happens, I'll be monitoring everything from home for a while. Shikamaru walked out, grumbling under his breath something about how troublesome it was going to be to hear her nag him about not coming home when he was supposed to. Naruto smirked and waved. He then focused on the report sitting in front of him, knowing it was filled with details he'd never understand, so he pushed it aside distastefully. He could feel a pair of eyes on him, burning with curiosity. So. Kiba leaned over to pet Akamaru. Naruto knew that it didn't bode well for him. What? Why was Kiba still in his office? Didn't he have a home to go to? There was a dangerous smirk on his face that made Naruto nervous. What happened for you to forget an appointment? Especially an important one? Ugh. He knew that was coming. What appointment? He was desperate to avoid the subject. The last thing he needed was Kiba prancing around like a peacock bragging about how right he was. His lead on the imaginary scoreboard was by far too much, if Naruto had anything to say about it. You were supposed to come here and have this particular conversation with Shikamaru and I yesterday, after you got kicked out of Hinata's for being an asshole. Kiba eyed the blonde, who squirmed in his chair with an irritated frown. You bastard, you broke my chair. Don't change the subject. Kiba ignored the daggers being glared his way. True, he had an unfortunate accident with the chair that involved Akamaru, a frisbee, and some sort of game, but that was beside the point. Naruto snorted crassly and crossed his arms, unwilling to participate in a bout of gossip in regards to his love life. Tell me. Kiba had broken into a complete grin by this point. He could pretty much figure out what had happened by the simple fact Naruto's stubborn streak had flared to monstrous proportions. What is this, high school? Naruto mumbled. Kiba laughed. Yeah, we're in high school and I want all the juicy little details. Naruto rolled his eyes. Forget it. I'm not saying shit. Kiba smirked. This only meant one thing, and one thing only. I was totally right. He stood up from the leather seat and did some strange little jig that had Naruto groaning in despair. A fucking victory dance. Naruto couldn't believe it. It's not like that, at all. He tried to get through the chanting and the hopping, but Kiba was completely ignoring him, too busy celebrating another point on the invisible scoreboard. Naruto pinched the bridge of his nose when Akamaru began to bark in celebration with his master. He really needed to fire Kiba, his sanity demanded it. Are you done? We have things to discuss. Naruto pointed to the rolled-up blueprints, trying to bar the image of Kiba gyrating his hips out of his eyeballs. Hearing the defeated tone in his friend's voice, Kiba decided to cut him some slack, but he would eventually get the nitty-gritty details out of him, even if it killed him. He picked up the rolled-up drafts, settled them on the graph table. Unrolling them carefully, he couldn't help but feel a tinge of envy at Naruto's natural talent. I don't know why you always ask for my opinion, your shit is always flawless, Kiba complained as his fingers grazed the top of the paper, following the dents created by several erased lines. He could tell that Naruto had spent far too much time rearranging ideas as he began to uncover Hinata's personality. He was right, this design was complete genius. From what he could tell, the area the garden was going to be in was a total pain in the ass, but Naruto had not only overcome the issues, he'd implemented every single detail Hinata had requested. The level of complexity was mind-boggling, to say the least, but it created the sanctuary she wanted. We're partners. I need your input and your uncanny ability to tell me if this is even possible to create. Kiba glanced over his shoulder. Naruto approached the table, a frown on his brow. It's possible, but a complete pain in the ass. There are a few adjustments we can make here and there to ease the work you'll have to do. He pulled the second sheet from the bottom and quickly glanced through it. This one determined the materials needed and the cost. This was massive, even for Naruto. You worked really hard on this. I think this is going to be the best one you've put together. Naruto chuckled, he had to disagree. His godfather's memorial garden was the best one he'd ever created. He'd poured part of his soul into that one. She's a special girl. I can't screw this up, he said without thinking. Kiba raised a brow, curious, but there was a distant look in Naruto's eyes that prevented him from asking any further. After I revise these, are they ready to go to Sai for the visual concept? Kiba's question interrupted the silence that had started to weigh in heavily, forcing Naruto back to focus on the current problems. Yeah, I still need to pass these by Shino so he can decide what he's going to use to upkeep the garden in a natural state. He squinted his eyes in thought. The entomologist was the secret to his success. Naruto tried to make the garden self-sufficient in fighting natural mini-disasters, especially indoor ones. Also, Shino trained his clients on the care and control of the little ladybug armies. He discovered over the years that women were more than willing to accept these little insects into their homes, and it was even better when they discovered that they could prevent the insects from flying and localize them to the garden. It all made his life a lot easier and it was a lot less upkeep work for the clients. If you're planning on getting this one started by next week, you need to get in touch with him today so he can start the colonies and get in contact with Hinata to train her. On how to take care of them, Kiba added, following Naruto's train of thought. He chuckled when Naruto sputtered out a "stop doing that," and threw a crumpled up piece of paper at his head. There was a chime that jingled while Kiba gathered the blueprints and prepared to leave for his office to do the edits. Naruto sat back down and dug the phone out of his pocket and looked to see who was calling him. He grinned and waved off Kiba, who stuck out his tongue at him before taking his leave. "Ah, Sakura. Just the girl I wanted to talk to." Naruto threw his feet on top of the desk and leaned back comfortably. "You'll never guess what happened after I left yesterday." Kiba shook his head before closing the door behind him. Sakura had to get a clue at some point. Naruto had moved on. Maybe this would be the push she needed to finally move on herself. Wait, where am I going? He certainly wasn't about to miss out on the juiciest moment of Naruto's life by walking away and working like a slave in his office. No way, Jose. He pressed his ear against the door and had to stop himself from snickering. Hinata was completely scandalized. She stared at the bowl in front of her, blushing furiously. Hanabi was grinning at her while she dumped the large bag of Skittles into it. "I shouldn't have told you anything. That's not how it works, sister dear." Hanabi snickered when Hinata pressed her lips together in rebellion. "You should know better by now. You don't mention anything to me unless you want something done about it." She did know better, but, somehow, she still opened her trap and spilled out the incredible and forward thing she did. Plus, it didn't help either that her sister had harassed her for nearly an hour before she finally pried out of her the details of the innocent little kiss she gave Naruto. Hanabi had been delighted when Hinata slipped out. He tasted like lemon Skittles, and had nearly run out of the house. The glint in her eye should have sent warning bells to Hinata when the younger woman grabbed the car keys and slammed the door shut. At first, Hinata wasn't sure where her sister had gone, thinking that she was finally on her own to reminisce on the latest events, all the things Naruto made her feel, but she was rudely interrupted again by her sister, who was carrying a theater-size bag of Skittles. "You seriously expect me to just waltz up to Naruto and ask him what? To play a game of Taste the Rainbow?" Hanabi chirped. Her sister was at a loss for words. Never in her life had she seen Hinata so completely vulnerable. This was fun. Hinata wouldn't have anything to do with it. It was so devious. It was just like her little sister to come up with something so sneaky and underhanded, just to steal a few kisses. "I refuse." Hanabi rolled her eyes and picked up the bowl of candy, grabbed her sister's wrist and dragged her to the living room. "We've just kissed for the first time yesterday. This is much too forward," she continued to argue. Hanabi only snorted and brushed her off, mumbling something about her eldest sister being a complete and total prude. "I am not." "Yes, you are." Hanabi turned around and stared at her flabbergasted sister. Hinata couldn't decide between laughing hysterically or glaring her sister into an early grave. Unfortunately for Hinata, Hanabi had grown immune to her cold and terrifying stares a long time ago and popped a candy in her mouth. "The rules are simple, one of you eats a candy, she crunched down on the little yellow candy in her mouth as she spoke, the other keeps their eyes closed, she pointed at Hinata, who could only continue to blush in complete horror, and the challenge for the one with their eyes closed is to discover what flavor the candy is. Hanabi smirked. But it's in our mouth. Oh God, she was going to faint. That's the point. Can't be a prude either, you got to taste it, she stuck out her tongue and made it wiggle, or it doesn't count. Count? Count for what? Was there supposed to be a prize at the end of this? She couldn't fathom the, oh wait, no she could, quite clearly in fact. Hanabi almost doubled over in laughter when her sister clued in as to the possible results of this little game were. Where did you learn such a perverted game? Niji told me about it, it's Tenten's favorite. Ugh. That's one piece of information she could have spent the rest of her life not knowing, blissfully ignorant of her cousin's foreplay games. A knock at the door saved Hinata from any further humiliation from her sister and was tickled pink when she discovered it was Konohamaru coming to whisk her sister away from her sanctuary. Finally, some peace. Oh really? Sakura was amused as she listened to Naruto chipper on about his kiss and what had transpired between the two after she dropped him off at Hinata's. Yeah, I passed right out after spending an hour working out the perfect apology, he grumbled. I forgot the whole damn thing the second I saw her. I felt so stupid. It all worked out in the end, right? She chuckled before eating another spoonful of ice cream. Well yeah. He felt heat on his cheeks and wondered what the hell he was doing blushing all by himself in his office. Anyway, she caught on to the flowers right away. Unlike a certain someone I know. It was no secret that she could never get his flower obsession, and she was actually glad someone out there understood his strange behavior. You're so goddamned cryptic with those flowers. How's a girl supposed to know the Naruto Encyclopedia of Weird Confessions? That hit a nerve on his end, it irked him how she belittled all his affections from the past and those for Hinata. Hinata does, he huffed, imagining as she rolled her eyes, which she did. You're both weird. I'm not surprised she understood. Her spoon clanged loudly against the bowl, and Naruto frowned at her unusual irritation. What else happened? Don't leave a girl hanging. He pressed his lips together, wondering if she was really all right. Well, we almost kissed. You did? She smirked. Sounds like you got interrupted. Yeah, her sister strolled in at the worst possible moment. It sucked. He grinned, recalling Hinata's cute little stutter and the various shades of pink and red she displayed on her face. Her sister's pretty funny, actually. Right up my alley with pranks. Sakura burst out laughing. She could just imagine poor Hinata getting terrorized by a prankster mode Naruto. He had the worst timing with that split personality of his. Stop laughing. He chuckled as well, but he suddenly sobered up, his thoughts lingering on Hinata. With her delicate nature under that entire tough exterior, the urge to protect her was almost overwhelming. You know, Sakura. Sakura paused, his seriousness caught her attention. Yeah. I think. I'm falling for her and it scares me a little bit. Why would it scare you? She gave a small chuckle, flinching at how his words, the sudden intimacy in which he whispered them through the phone, cut through her. Several seconds went by and Naruto didn't answer her question, lost in thought. Naruto. Ah, sorry for saying that, I'm not sure what came over me. The sober mood was dispelled as quickly as it came. It's fine. Sakura's voice was warm, comforting. I'm happy for you. I'm glad. I'm glad you found someone. You think so? He laughed, it was odd to hear Sakura so subdued. Yeah, I know so. She grinned despite the strange sense of loss coming over her. Naruto had found his love and she couldn't forget Sasuke no matter what she did. Her heart ached suddenly and the need for the mysterious boy crawled out from the darkest depth of her memories. Would she ever be able to move on, and forget about him? She doubted it, she needed closure before she could be happy with someone else. Maybe. I'm not sure she feels that way, though. Naruto sighed, dragging Sakura out of her darkened mood. What would make you say that? She doesn't seem too sure about things, always nervous. You're retarded. Sakura rolled her eyes and put the empty bowl on her coffee table, sucking on a bit of ice cream that dared escape her bowl from her thumb as she listened to Naruto sputter. What? You are retarded. Sakura couldn't possibly say it any slower if she tried. She wasn't entirely surprised that he didn't realize how overwhelming his focused attention was. She knew it firsthand. As flattering as it was a little scary to be the center of Naruto Uzumaki's world. Explain to me why you think that. His tone of voice suggested she choose her words carefully, but she knew him far too long to pay attention to anything he warned about. Because you're completely clueless. Naruto snorted. Although this may have been true, that didn't explain anything. Sakura grumbled at his snort, and he demanded she be more specific, forcing her to think a lot harder than she was prepared for at that instant. She's probably not very confident around you. That much was obvious to anyone, even Naruto. You're like a beam of energy and it's hard to follow you sometimes, to keep up. She sighed. She knew he wouldn't get it. I don't get it. Figures. Sakura quietly rubbed the length of her face and held a groan in check. He was so frustrating. Let's try this again. You have a tendency to be relentless when you go after something you really want, Naruto. She's probably overwhelmed by the pushiness of your intentions. My pushiness? Her words cut through him like a slap. Was he really pushy? Did he overwhelm her? Yeah. Just take it slow, Naruto. She'll come out of her shell eventually. The best love is a patient one. There was a soft knock at her door, and Sakura said her goodbyes and hung up the phone. Naruto stared ahead, wondering exactly what he was supposed to do to be a little less Naruto. If he did that, would that make Hinata more comfortable to be herself around him? Wouldn't that defeat the purpose, though? This was beyond complicated. Sakura always managed to make him doubt himself, past and present, and for the first time in his life, his confidence was shaken. The sun had begun to set before Kiba strolled back into Naruto's office with the edited version to Hinata's gardens. There wasn't much to change per se, just an adjustment in reality. Some of the designs he came up with were really out there, and unless you owned NASA's anti-gravity chamber, they were impossible to create. You going home soon? Naruto looked up from his graph table. Black ink was smudged on his cheek as he scratched at the scars hiding under it. There was a strange hesitation on his part that had Kiba rolling his eyes. He could tell Sakura had said something to shake him up. Even though she probably just mentioned something in passing with all the good intentions in the world, she didn't really understand Naruto and burdened him with a lot of her own insecurities. Yeah, you need to head out to Hinata's and ignore whatever Sakura said. Kiba dropped the plans on the coffee table and glanced at Naruto, who had flinched at the seriousness of the words. Naruto sighed. He was too transparent for his own good. Just nothing. Kiba was irritated, she had done a number on him. You were all psyched this morning and now you're acting like a hermit. Get the hell out of here. You're not even supposed to be in the office for a week solid. Kiba pointed at the door, grabbed Naruto's jacket and called over Akamaru. The mutt was more than happy to help his master push out the struggling landscapist from the confines of his oversized office. What the foo, shut up already. Now, get out of here, I'm busy. Kiba shouted as he pushed Naruto into the elevator. Akamaru growled when Naruto tried to stand up from his sprawled position on the floor. He shot Kiba a dirty look, but it was met with a toothy grin, a cheeky, have fun, and the click of the elevator's metal doors. Naruto sighed and picked himself off the floor, brushing off invisible dust. He wasn't sure how to broach the subject with Hinata. How do you ask someone if they're too much? Well, he certainly wasn't going to casually walk up to her and say, "Hey, I noticed you can barely stay conscious around me, does that mean I'm too much for you?" That sounded ridiculous. It's not like she was fainting every time they met or touched. She was just, really nervous and clamped up so bad she could barely function. In fact, she was like an entirely different person. Fuck, I really am moving too fast. He fisted his hands and sighed. Moments later, the metal doors opened and let him out towards the entrance of his building as he waved to the guard and walked out towards his car. Figuring that the drive to Hinata's was a little ways, he decided he'd use up the time to come up with something. Now that he had Hinata where he wanted her, he couldn't afford to lose her. The mere thought of it squeezed at his heart. Hinata cursed at her sweaty hands, there was a lump in her stomach that made her want to curl up on the floor and forget the whole dare from her sister. Whatever possessed her to agree to this lunacy was beyond her, but there was something deep inside her that had her fired up to try it. Of course, it had nothing to do with the fact she was itchy to feel his lips on hers again, or the way his eyes turned into that deep blue when his mind was full of her. Nope, no influence from that whatsoever. Whom am I kidding? She slumped over on the ottoman, her mind possessed by the presence of Naruto. It was strange how he had barged into her life, their meeting completely accidental at the phone kiosk, his familiarity had clicked something inside her and it had gone downhill from there. Well, not downhill, necessarily. Far from it in fact, she was glad that her indifference with the world had all but vanished. She felt a little out of whack with her newfound memories and all the things they meant. Her family was becoming close to her heart again, the road to forgiving herself had begun. Her father wanted to heal their relationship as well, which she had a little bit of trouble accepting after all the pain, but she was willing. She shook her head, now wasn't the time to think on these things, there were more pressing urgent matters at hand. Like figuring out how to do this without resorting to losing consciousness, and convincing Naruto she wasn't a loose woman. It was silly to be this nervous, she was a Hyuga, the pillar of strength and determination, and she wouldn't lose to a trivial thing like emotions. She groaned, pressing her fingertips against her forehead, she leaned back and let her head hit the cushioned back of the ottoman, squeezing her eyes shut. Where is my Eris persona when I need it? She mumbled to herself before opening her eyes and meeting a pair of amused blue ones, staring at her from above. Hinata! She screamed, startling Naruto. Hinata stood up suddenly, her hands flew to her mouth to silence the surprised yell and she backed up into the coffee table. The back of her knees bumped against the wood and jarred the piece of furniture awkwardly, tipping the bowl of Skittles and spilling half its content on the table and floor. The sound of the Skittles was loud in Hinata's ears, almost deafening. Naruto had reached over the ottoman and grabbed her elbow when she nearly fell. Are you okay? His fingers were cold against the warmth of her flesh. I'm fine, she answered. How mortifying, not exactly the way she envisioned greeting him when he returned. His gaze had left hers and focused on the mess she had caused. He smirked. It took everything in her not to groan and run out of the room. Not only was Hanabi's plan completely transparent, she didn't have the courage to pull it off. She wasn't daring, she wasn't a free spirit. She was a stiff Hyuga. She did groan this time, and it was pretty loud. Naruto focused his attention back on her, his brow quirked up slowly, questioning her obvious distress. She was too humiliated to even phantom blushing, so she decided to kneel down and start picking up the candies. Naruto shook his head slightly, wondering what exactly had her so flustered. He decided not to ask and kneeled down next to her, helping to pick up the source of her embarrassment. The shared silence was welcomed by the heiress, but there was something a little strange about Naruto, he seemed almost subdued. She expected some kind of joke or comment on how she had a giant bowl of Skittles waiting for him, but he remained quiet, with that strange little smirk on his lips. Everything all right? She didn't look away when he glanced at her. He shrugged before seating himself on the floor, crossing his legs Indian style. Ah, yeah, there are a few complications with another company. I can't really talk about it or I might have to kill you. He grinned, making her roll her eyes. She knew he wasn't being entirely honest. She remembered the signs from their childhood. He scratched behind his ear, had a strange lopsided grin and his eyes looked away from her face, avoiding any kind of contact. A sure flag that Naruto Uzumaki was trying to avoid something unpleasant. Besides that, she gave him a small reassuring smile that made him frown. Something else is bothering you, I can tell. He should have known better. The Hyuga were known for their amazing skill in reading body language. Well, this was a pivotal moment. He had to choose his words carefully not to mislead her. You know, Hinata, his gaze had gone back to the Skittles, his fingers picked up a few here and there before dropping them on the table. I know I make you pretty nervous. He bit his lower lip. Lightly, she wasn't moving, but her eyes were watching him carefully, which wasn't helping him relax. What do you mean? Was her nervousness that obvious? She thought she had that pretty much under control, besides screaming when she saw him a few moments ago. Oh God, I'm completely transparent. She mentally kicked herself. How can I say this? I mean, I want you to. He clamped up, annoyed with himself. Want me to? She leaned forward, catching his wandering attention, her fingers grazed his own and he suddenly felt a little silly. She moved closer to him and leaned her head against his shoulder. He put an arm around her shoulders and squeezed her close to him. He smiled, forgetting his worry a moment. Gathering all his courage, he let out a calming breath and just let the words flow out of his mouth. I want you to tell me if we're going too fast. Hinata perked a brow, amused slightly at his worry. She had been mulling over the same question all day and the sudden need to laugh was almost overwhelming. If you just want pecks on the cheek or just hold hands, I'm okay with that. He nodded, resolved to make sure she was comfortable with him in all aspects. He didn't want to chase her off with his influence if she wasn't entirely prepared to deal with his personality. Hinata had to stop herself from laughing. Why are you so worried about such a silly thing? She hid a giggle behind her hand, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Naruto glanced down and caught her good mood. He smiled nervously. Well, it's something Sakura mentioned to me today. I guess it had me thinking some weird things. Hinata sighed, Sakura. Of course. Why the sigh? He pushed her with his shoulder, she gave him a little pout which made him grin. She brought her free hand to his cheek and touched it with her fingertips, tracing the visible scars. Her face had gone very serious and she had him completely attentive. I'm perfectly fine the way things are. You're not going too fast or too slow, she half whispered, her eyes focused on his bronzed skin. He kept very still, her voice imprinting itself inside his mind. In fact, sometimes I worry that it's me that's going far too slow. Naruto let out a sigh, glad to know she was worried too. He eyed the Skittles and picked one up from the bowl. He felt Hinata shift, her fingers paused on his face and an impish grin played on his lips. So, what's with the candy? Hinata blushed, hard. He was totally onto her. A silly idea, she tried to huff, disregarding the afternoon's events. Does it have something to do with a certain something that happened yesterday? He teased. This wasn't helping her increasing embarrassment. This was outside of her comfort zone, foreign territory that terrified and excited her. She heard a snicker and a, "You're so cute when you blush," which only made her want to crawl under a rock. Emma maybe. She couldn't look at him. He stopped moving, and quirked a brow. Towards his little princess attempting to be a sneaky vixen. It was kind of amusing, so he played along. He watched her pick up a candy, slip it in her mouth and defiantly stare at him, her lips pressed together, challenging his impish grin. He laughed, he wasn't sure what she was doing, but it was funny as hell considering she looked ready to tackle the world with sweets in her mouth. Hinata, what are, play with me, she cut him off before he could finish his sentence. Play what, exactly? He knew what she was getting at, but getting her to say it to him was much more amusing. Her expression was priceless. He was well aware it was taking everything in her to travel down this road, to step outside her norm. Pulling her out of that shell was a lot more fun than he anticipated. She narrowed her eyes at him, crossed her arms and tried to get her nervousness under control. He was being daft on purpose, she could tell just by the way he was twisting a strand of her hair, plus his snickering and the gleeful glint in his eyes was a dead giveaway. You know what I mean, she mumbled, her gaze focused on the bowl. She looked miffed with him, so he laughed again and caved in, unable to resist her. Okay. What are the rules to this little game? His voice was laced with curiosity, the velvet vibration was music to her ears. They're pretty simple. Her voice had a little shake in it, Naruto found it endearing. We each take turns with a skittle and the other has to guess the flavor. Oh God, she was going to faint. Naruto's interest was piqued, and he closed in towards her face. He eyed her lips and had this little quizzical expression. How am I supposed to guess? Like this, she brought her hand to his eyes and closed his eyelids, her fingers traced down to his lips and she sat up on her knees. She took in a calming breath and leaned in, capturing his lips in a tender and shy kiss. She parted her lips and invited him quietly to explore her mouth. He was very responsive, immediately accepting the invitation and gliding his tongue against hers. She let herself be carried away by the feel of his lips on her own, the heat of his arms when they wrapped themselves around her small waist. She broke the contact, breathless. The first thing she noticed was the complete blissful look on his face, which brought a small cheer from her feminine pride. She waited for him to open his eyes and was met with the deep blue of his heated gaze. Cherry, he mumbled. Satisfied with his answer, she closed her own eyes and waited for him to choose his own little candy. Does that make us even? He almost laughed at her quizzical expression. What do you mean? She leaned back against the seat behind her and closed her eyes, licking her lips in anticipation. She heard the crunch inside his mouth and was nearly shaking with anticipation. Naruto let the sweet and sour taste wrap itself around his tongue before dipping his head and caressed her mouth with his own, demanding to be let in. You already guessed the lemon from yesterday, he murmured against her lips before taking them with his own. He let out a groan when her fingers tangled themselves in his hair, dispelling the intimate silence. He hadn't even noticed her wrapping her arms around his neck. He retaliated by pulling up the edges of her blouse and grazed her skin, which seemed to snap her out of the kiss-induced daze. She reluctantly pulled away, breaking the intimate contact before his fingers got any further up under her blouse. She smirked against his lips and whispered, "Grape." "Correct," he purred out, the vibration of his voice made her toes curl. He nipped her chin as she reached for another skittle, she pulled him down to the floor, ignoring the candies pressing on her back, and he let his weight press down on her, waiting for her to give him the okay to play. He kissed her again, and she giggled when he didn't guess the right flavor. Whose idea was this? He asked her between each breath. She snorted indignantly. Naruto laughed when she mumbled her sister's name. We should play more often. He grinned at her before taking another skittle between his lips. She blushed but meekly nodded when he stole another kiss from her willing lips. It soon became obvious to him that Hinata was more than willing to lead and set the pace for them to follow, and he was grateful for that. Mad Hatter, are you really mad? She thought while her finger lightly caressed the words on the page. The dents of the printed ink bubbled unevenly under the skin of her index finger and they felt sticky between the creases of the fingerprints. Despite the tactile flattery, the question still lingered, was the Mad Hatter truly insane or just a very cynical and deeply insightful philosopher? She sighed, her mind wandering off the whimsical question. Who really knew what mental state the Hatter was supposed to have? His existence was very much illogical. She flicked another page and quickly read through the passages, hunting for something specific. Ah, here we go, she mused as she settled deeper into the ottoman, now back to its rightful place much to Naruto's dismay. The Cheshire Cat appears, throwing the OCD Mad Hatter into a frenzied and even more disorganized chaos. The whole place is turned right side up, but the cat couldn't care less. It was a creature of chaos and a misfit through and through. Hinata smiled despite herself. The cat reminded her of Naruto. It was unpredictable, on several levels, and had no intention on excusing itself for messing up even the best laid plans. Well, in truth, as cumbersome and irritating the cat was, his purpose was the most important in this story. Just as the author intended, Hinata imagined. The more she thought about it, the more she realized why Naruto reminded her of the Cheshire Cat. Just like Alice's thorn in her side, Naruto created a torrent of instability that infiltrated her life. Adding to that, she wasn't accustomed to the way he moved everything around. It was almost forceful, shoving everything around until it was rearranged to his liking. That almost made her angry. Not necessarily at him, but more towards herself. It was her, if anything, that allowed him to take over and, even more so, she was helpless to stop his invasion when he looked at her with that smile. She had absolutely no control over herself or the situation when Naruto Uzumaki strolled into her personal space. His energy, his confidence, naturally overtook everything he touched. He was so sure of who he was and where he was going, it infected her through and through. Not only did it pique her curious side, it was devastatingly attractive. She admired the fact there was rarely any doubt in his words, not a single inkling of fear in anything he did. It did something to her deep inside, it made dangerous things tick. It's that smile, she confirmed within herself. That smile was like that of the cat, full of promises, tricks and vague ambiguity that warned her to steer clear, but that she just couldn't stay away from. She realized in the past week that his chaos and her loss of control was something she had been craving for a long time. Her life, since her accident, had always been under careful and tight control. Her purpose was always clear and she never questioned it. Despite the careful control she exuded over her little world, she overlooked the possibility of someone willing to break her. Naruto had made himself comfortable despite her objections, crawled under her skin and embedded himself in the back of her skull. The man had interrupted her peace and obliterated her sense of order, forcing her world to spin off its axis and crumble in the span of a week. She wasn't sure how to defend herself against Naruto's affection without being swallowed by it. But did she really need to defend herself? Wasn't this something she wanted? One more question to add to her lengthy list. She carefully flipped another page, her eyes caressed the words as she skipped paragraphs. A soft smile played on her lips when she found one particular passage she favored. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? Hinata whispered the question to no one in particular. She cleared her throat, taking on a deeper octave as she relayed the cat's innocent answer, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. That particular passage had more than one meaning, everyone knew that, but it was the first time she felt it touched her, as though it would open a door deep within herself that she had never been entirely ready to open. Pressing her lips together, she tried to ignore the heated feeling deep inside her gut, but she couldn't help repeating the words inside her head. Where did she want to go in this little journey with Naruto? Did she truly want to follow his chaos? She let out a strange shaky contemplative sigh. Indeed, lately, she wanted to explore the new path she had wandered on, to explore it with him. She wanted to know, more than anything, where it would lead to, even if it was terrifying. Where would this path lead, exactly? Yet another question that stumped her. The fear of the unknown was something she wasn't really used to, considering everything in her life had been planned from the get-go. It was frustrating her more than she was willing to admit. She dismissed the questions and focused once more on the story. The protagonist of this twisted fairy tale has wandered away and is now lost in the strange woods of Wonderland. Hinata could picture Alice, standing on the path, in the dark shadows of the forest, frightened as she comes face to face with the stark reality that she is alone. But not for long, of course. The mysterious cat appears only to confuse the gentle Alice further. Hinata could almost feel the increased frustration of the young woman as the cat went a roundabout way to answer her. The young lady was futilely trying to make sense of an illogical world, and her struggle amused the cat to no end. Hinata could relate to Alice's frustrations. Like the Cheshire Cat, Naruto seemed amused by her struggle in shedding her former self. Well, not necessarily amused, but far too interested. She looked up from the page and focused on the window as she continued the lines she had memorized so long ago and whispered again as Alice, "I don't much care where." Hinata paused in her private rendering of Alice in Wonderland, her fingers pressed against the pages, and clenched the book close to her face. Pressing the open pages to her lips, she narrowed her eye as she thought about Alice's answer. Until recently, she couldn't really remember what her life had been like. It was, well, it was safe, for the lack of a better word. Everything was plotted out for her to step into her father's shoes. Her life wasn't filled with the struggles or worries of everyday people, it had been designed to be completely glitch-free. If she ever had to concern herself with anything, it was with conserving the consistency of her father's quiet approval. But all that had changed recently with this sickness her father was afflicted with. The very core of his existence was threatened by something he couldn't control, and as if that had been the final push for him to realize how wrong he'd been all these years, he'd apologized for his efforts in preventing the return of her former self. She couldn't quite make out what the meaning behind his begging for her forgiveness when it became obvious that he had no intention of allowing her to be anything other than what he wanted to mold. Not only was he only mildly remorseful, he was now more than just a little determined that she follow in his footsteps, like he willed that the leadership of the company will fall to her without any question. Despite his claim that she was free to choose, it was still just as her father had carefully planned, for several years. She couldn't help but feel slightly resentful towards her father's efficiency. Had this happened 2 weeks ago, before she had laid eyes on the clown-faced Naruto at the phone kiosk, she would have accepted it for what it was, the passing of an era to the younger generation, an heir who was worthy of its crown. She puffed her cheeks rebelliously, the notion left a sour taste in her mouth. This sounds like I'm inheriting a clan from the old days, certainly not a business. Their family had a long and proud history within the city of Konoha, something she couldn't exactly dismiss with her need to break free from the chains of her family's traditions. Up until now, she hadn't cared where she ended up or how she got there. In all honesty, she had no interest in looking elsewhere. Was that really what she wanted to do, though? Was it her own feelings to want to take over the Hyuga Corporation and continue on with its mission, or was that just something her father had implanted in her subconscious while grooming her for the leader position? She wasn't so sure anymore. Then it doesn't much matter which way you go, the sly cat replied to the confused and bewildered Alice. So long as I get somewhere. The heiress put the book down on her lap and let her head rest against the back of the ottoman, staring out of the window again. The rest of the passage played out in her mind, like an old record. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if only you walk long enough." Hinata agreed with the cat at this point, but she also agreed to an extent with the young woman. Alice was trapped in strange and unfamiliar surroundings. So, truthfully, getting somewhere, anywhere really, is better than the darkness and uncertainty of the forest. Hinata paused in her reading, pursing her lips in thought. Getting anywhere just to get away from the maze seemed to suggest, to Hinata, that Alice was desperate to escape the unknown. The Cheshire would continue on, telling her that in either direction there were mad people, so it didn't matter where she went. Alice would refuse, stating she did not want to be amongst the mad. Hinata let out a soft laugh and shook her head. She had to admire Alice's determination, but she failed to see the cat's point. In reality, everyone is mad to some extent. Hinata bit her lip slightly, thinking on her father and how she had ended up in his tangled web. Yes, everyone is justifiably mad for the right reasons. In the end, Alice would learn that it wasn't the destination that mattered, but how you got there and what you learned on the journey. The cat was far too clever for Alice, as was Naruto for her. Hinata put the book down again on her lap and frowned. Had she been walking aimlessly, trying to get to a place she had no desire to go to? Was that why she was still sitting here, at home? Was she so unsure of herself and what she wanted that she was resorting to hiding from her responsibilities? No. No. It wasn't that. She didn't lack confidence in her ability to do her job. So what was it? Was it because her planned destination was now unwanted? No, she said out loud, surprising herself. She settled further into her seat, sighing. It wasn't a question of it being unwanted, she realized after a little more thought, it was that it had changed. She still wanted to follow her father's footsteps in the business he built, but she wanted to break out of the mold. She didn't want to be alone any longer. The walls had definitely cracked, no thanks to her meddling siblings and Naruto. Despite their little plan, she still wanted her journey to continue as it was unfurling, and then maybe, just maybe, Naruto would be willing to come along too. Hinata, Naruto's voice pulled her out of her thoughts and she glanced his way as he approached her. Can you take a look at this and tell me if you are happy with this design? He wasn't looking at her, his brow was scrunched up in thought over his work. She'd recently discovered that she found it was cute, the pensive Naruto. The way his lips pouted slightly, the hum he made and even the annoying habit of sucking air through the tiny gap between his front teeth was teetering on adorable. I must be ill. How is that even cute? She sighed, which caught his attention. She had to stifle a laugh when he gave her a "what's the matter" cock of the head before sitting down beside her. She couldn't help but wonder if he would really want to come along on her journey of self-discovery. Hinata couldn't form the words in her mouth, her tongue felt heavy and uncooperative. She nodded at him when he glanced up from the paper he was unrolling carefully with his long fingers. She let her gaze linger on them, realizing something about the man that was attached to them. They were the physical representation of his journey, the extension of his ideals as an artist within the landscape industry. They were what allowed him to express his ideas, love and dedication with the use of a pencil, a piece of paper and a shovel full of manure. She envied them, those fingers, not because of the hidden talent, but because they were an intimate part of him that she would never truly understand. Maybe it was childish of her to think like that, but she was utterly jealous of what they touched. She wanted them to be focused on her, her skin, her muscles, the heat of her want for him. She blinked, surprised at her sudden revelation. She regretted the feeling of possessiveness immediately. The papers lay unusually flat on the coffee table. The draft had a strange type of paper that prevented it from rolling up on its own, like it was thicker than normal drafts. Only the corners furled up, resisting the urge to obey the makeup of its design. Naruto waited for her opinion, watching her carefully from the corner of his eyes. A small amused smile played on his lips as he noted how she intensely watched his hands. That's kinda hot. He could feel her gaze against his skin. Naruto felt a set of goosebumps crawling up his arm and he realized rather quickly that his thoughts were dangerously turning towards a road he knew Hinata would reprimand him for. He attempted to quietly clear his throat, forcing the Jiraiya-driven scenarios out of his mind. Focus, Uzumaki. Focus on the Databayo. Hinata gave him a strange look. He froze. Could she read his mind? She let out a little snort and turned her gaze to the draft, forcing him to think that she really could read his mind. He cleared his throat again and stared at the paper on the table. Although Kiba had already fixed most of the minor details, this was more or less the final draft to be graphed by Sai. He heard a small gasp out of her and grinned. This was one of his best works. He had spent a lot of time picking this woman apart, never mind the fact that using and placing all the flowers that she requested in the contract made his design even more difficult. He had figured out in the end that this should be a garden of healing for the heiress. He knew that she wanted desperately to be forgiven for what happened with her mother and he made sure that it radiated peace and serenity. In the center of the garden there was a small shrine to pay her respect, surrounded by thick foliage and plants. It was isolated, but nonetheless very colorful. Here she could relax. Its purpose, however, was for her to forgive herself. He was sure she would achieve it there. "It's going to be beautiful," she said, almost breathless. Naruto watched as her fingers trailed the penciled lines on the thin paper. He found it strangely alluring, how the delicate digits caressed the paper. He cleared his throat slightly, trying to ignore the impulse to grab her fingers and kiss the tips. "Of course it is," he replied. "Who do you think thought this up?" She had the urge to roll her eyes at the cocky tone in his voice. She should have known better, but she secretly enjoyed that self-assured aspect of his personality. "Well, I'm satisfied with this." She barely had the words out before she noticed a gleam in his eyes. The air suddenly felt thick and electric. She gulped. Oh. She had a bad feeling. "Was it that easy to satisfy you?" His voice was thick with a tone she'd never heard before. He leaned in, quickly closing the space between them and rubbed the tip of his nose by her earlobe, very lightly. She felt goosebumps crawl up from the base of her back and she pushed down a shudder of pleasure. She could feel his gaze travel down her neck and without really thinking she took in a deeper breath, forcing her breasts to press against the material of her blouse. He hummed in approval. She was speechless at the obvious lewd stare and her unconscious reaction to it. What? She tried to regain some dignity by feigning innocence, but the damned stutter was back in full force and Naruto grinned like a cat. He'd completely caught her off guard again. She's so cute, he thought, quite pleased with himself. "You heard me," he purred out, a whispered promise that made her toes curl. She barely had time to blink as the information processed itself at a snail's pace inside her head and in an instant, he was inside her space. His warm lips brushed against hers like feathers and she kept staring at him dumbfounded. Taking advantage of the situation, Naruto demanded entrance to her slightly agape mouth and she obediently let him in. This seemed to snap her out of it and she mumbled something. He ignored her muffled pleas since there was no resistance coming from her petite fists. In fact, they had bunched up the front of his shirt and were pulling him towards her. Once he was leaned snugly against her, she let go of his shirt, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and sighed while her fingers deeply tangled themselves in his hair within seconds. He grinned against her lips and delved deeper into the kiss, relishing the fact that all he could taste was Hinata. The persistent beeping of his laptop woke him from his light slumber. He rubbed his eyes and squinted against the light sneaking in through the closed bedroom curtains. He stirred, but he felt heavy under the duvet, his left arm numb from something heavy against it. He peeked from one eye and perked a brow while suppressing a grin. There, tightly wound around him like a lost child, was his wife. He leaned down and kissed her lightly on the forehead, appreciating her happy sigh. The beep caught his attention again and he glared in its direction. He shifted slowly from his comfortable position against the blonde and eyed the object that was dangerously close to disturbing the sleeping lioness. He felt a bead of sweat form on his temple as he carefully and stealthily untangled himself from her loving grasp. It's not that he necessarily feared his wife, more like he feared Temari's temper when she didn't get all her shut-eye. His feet hit the carpet quietly and he spared a look over his shoulder to confirm she was still asleep. She stirred and her hand sought out his warmth, but her fingers found the band of his boxer's elastic. She pulled, making him freeze. She then let out a small groan that dangerously sounded like a giggle and the sharp snap of the elastic broke the patterned beeping of the computer. He grumbled, irritated with her hidden prankster nature. Troublesome woman. He somehow managed to escape her without any repercussions and he sighed almost in relief as he quickly made his way to his desk to pick up the laptop. Glancing over his shoulder once more to ensure that his wife had settled back into a deep sleep, Shikamaru picked up the computer and made his way into the living room. Once settled, his fingers became a blur as he sifted through the data on the screen. The techs at White Snake were accessing Naruto's servers again from a new set of proxies, right where Shikamaru wanted them. He started a dump of all the data into a separate file so that he could peruse the incident at his leisure and began to track everything his opponent did. After several seconds, he realized that all of the processes occurring on the server were too much for one tech to be causing. Regardless of how good Shikamaru was, he couldn't reliably track multiple attacks and come up with a way of breaking their security at the same time. He needed help. He immediately scratched Temari's name off the list. She was hell to deal with when woken early. He thought to call Kiba, but quickly thought better of it knowing that the dog owner was probably at one of Naruto's work sites. That left him with two options. Looking at the clock, Shikamaru did some quick subtractions and decided his brother-in-law in Japan had probably had enough rest, unless, of course, he'd been out at the clubs the night before. Troublesome wingman bullshit, he thought. No time like the present to find out. The pineapple-haired man picked up his cell phone from the coffee table and hit the speed dial. There was a long pause on the line before it began to ring. On the second ring, a tired voice picked up the line. "Yeah," was the simple greeting. "Kankuro, I need you to jump onto Shadow Server and help me with the incoming feed from port." He trailed off and checked his screen to make sure he got the right digits, 8266. There was a 2-second pause on the line before Shikamaru heard a sigh from the other man. This certainly beats the lunch plans he had with Kiba. Hinata let out a sigh under him as he kissed the length of her neck. Her fingers were tangled deeply in his hair and he groaned when she called his name very quietly against his ear. His fingers had meticulously unbuttoned most of her blouse without any objection from the heiress. He certainly hadn't expected such good fortune, but he wasn't about to refuse her offer. He greedily licked at the pale white skin, sucked lightly on her pulse point and discovered it was a very sensitive spot as she squirmed under him and let out an effeminate moan. Hinata felt him grin against her neck. She was embarrassed she had reacted that way, but soon forgot about it when he found another sensitive area on her collarbone. "Ah," she gasped, and there, the feel of his lips stretching into another grin against her skin. Who knew you were so sensitive," he mumbled between hot breaths. She couldn't answer, so she merely mewed strangely. He looked up from where he was diligently recording the taste of her skin and caught her heated gaze. Her blush was steadily building and she looked ravishing. He reached around and pulled at the elastic of her bun and freed the indigo hair from its restrictive prison. She bit at her lip, refusing to let him see the goosebumps that had raced across the back of her neck and perked her nipples. He'd seen it. He raised a brow, and he had another infuriating smirk on his face. "He's definitely just like the damned cat." She ignored him, her arms tightening around his shoulders, and she let one set of fingers dance across the length of his back. He closed his eyes and for the first time, she was witness to a lustful Naruto. His cheeks were tinged with a light pink and his brow knitted lightly as she explored the muscle hidden under the black dress shirt. She let herself scratch down the length of his back to see how he'd react. Even though it was light and he was still dressed, it felt like hot iron. He hissed at the burn, arching his back, which caused her to blink in curiosity. "Careful, Hinata," he groaned with restraint and sought out her lips. He bit her lower lip and she moaned into his mouth when he swallowed them and tasted her again. At first she thought she'd hurt him, but soon realized she'd discovered one of his weaknesses. This time it was him that felt her lips pull back into a grin. She opened her mouth to say something witty, but before she could say anything, he settled between her legs and pushed against her heated sex. She was still wearing her pajama pants, but he could feel the heat of her arousal through them. It was her turn to hiss. Her fingers found the edge of his pants and she pulled out his tucked-in shirt. He leaned his forehead against the arm of the ottoman and held his lust in check. Her nails dug down at the skin of his back and he marched into her again, forcing out a groan from him. Right then, she felt a tingle between her legs that made her hitch her breath. Her sex was starting to heat up, almost pulsing. She moaned his name as he pushed against her again. He whispered her name and she lost track of what happened next. That tingle again, this time it pulsed. "Ooh," she hitched her breath again, her eyes closed tightly. She squirmed as Naruto licked from her collarbone to the mounds of her breasts and bit at the edge of her bra, snapping them lightly against the breast. She giggled, but it didn't last long as he thrust his hips against her again. The tingle came back, stronger, and she gasped. For fuck's sakes. Naruto grumbled under his breath. He sat up quickly and mumbled more profanities under his breath. He untangled himself from his lover's fingers and cursed at the throbbing hard-on in his pants. Hinata gasped in surprise as she tried to process why her boyfriend had suddenly disappeared. What? Why did you stop? She was breathless, flushed and utterly turned on. Naruto reached into his pants pocket and pulled out his cell phone that was vibrating quite violently. Sorry. It won't stop ringing and it's coming from the emergency line. Hinata frowned, and then clued in. She turned beet red realizing that the phone was responsible for the persistent tingle she was feeling between her legs. Oh. Oh God. She couldn't believe it, the cell phone was now the vibrator phone and she was mortified. Naruto gave her a strange look. Before he flipped the phone open and openly glared at it. What, Kiba? What in God's name do you want? He roared to the phone, openly irritated with the inconsiderate, persistent calls from his business partner. Hinata thought she was going to pass out. She was positive there wasn't a hole big enough in this world that could swallow her and bury her mounting embarrassment. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, Kankuro slowly got out of his bed with a sigh while being careful not to disturb the small figure lying next to him. He kept his voice low as he got himself dressed. Sounds big, Shika. Shadow servers not supposed to exist, yet no. The amused voice of his sister's husband came back through the headset. What the enemy doesn't know just might kill them. The muscular brunette had to hold back a snort of laughter at the truth of that statement. Sparing the girl in bed one final glance, he closed the bedroom door and made his way to his computer room. The high-powered desktop was already on, so he had only to type in his password once he was settled into the chair. After the desktop came up, Kankuro quickly brought up his command prompt and opened a connection to the highly secret server sitting at Nara Corporate Solutions on the other side of the world. After another quick login, the server prompted him for a connection. 8266, right? He queried. Right. Give me your read on what you see once you get in, ordered the lazy entrepreneur. What Kankuro saw was no surprise to him. The data on screen looked like a straightforward case of corporate espionage at first glance, but Shikamaru never called him for something so simple. Time to play the puppet master. After flipping on the coffee maker next to his monitor, Kankuro went to work. I've got it, man, he said as his fingers got down to the serious business of creating a program to crack the enemy system on his second monitor while sifting through the data on the main one with his eyes. It looks like someone sticking their finger into a pie that ain't theirs. He switched to another window and scrolled down the page, more like several pies. Yeah, I've already got this feed dumping so we can go over it later. We're pretty sure we know what these guys are up to, but we need more proof, Shikamaru explained over the line. Kankuro reached over and replaced the coffee urn with his mug before continuing. So we're letting them slowly tighten their own noose, he asked with a sadistic grin. Noting that his mug was almost full, he quickly switched the mug for the urn again. Sounds fun. Kankuro could hear the lazy man's smile as he spoke. Once we have the information we need, we can hand it over to the police, and the judge isn't going to care how we got the information once it's in his hands. So, you think you can get me into this system, Kankuro? He asked. Kankuro heard a sliver of hesitation in his friend's voice, but decided to ignore it for the time being. Instead, he opened yet another command prompt and started making small attacks on the system in question, things like spam and whatnot that wouldn't trip a big response from the automated security systems that were bound to be there. What he saw looked promising. He carefully prodded all over to try and find a weakness. After several more seconds passed, he found what he was looking for, and so much more. Computer programming is an art form more than it is a hard science. Just like there were a finite number of commands at one's disposal, so were there only so many colors for an artist to paint with, and just like every painter had a unique style, so, too, does every programmer. It was how one used those resources that made the art. I don't think it'll be an issue, Shika, he replied with a smile. Apparently the smile carried over the phone, because Shikamaru immediately gave a relieved sigh. We need to bring in an expert though. I just dunno if she's still willing to do this for you after you up and quit the game when you married Temari. Oh. You seriously think we need to bring her in? Came the worried response from the earpiece. Even though he knew it wouldn't be seen, Kankuro nodded his head and pointed at the imaginary Shika in front of him. Yeah, she's perfect for this. She can be in and out of their system so fast, they'll never know she was there, he reasoned as he spun his chair to face the doorway. From what she's told me, her boss lets her keep in practice. Unlike a certain lazy bastard that has no similar excuse, he jabbed with an evil grin before taking a sip of his drink. Back on his side of the Pacific, Shikamaru sighed and connected the call to conference. Okay, let me call Ino. Pretty woman rang crudely from the cell phone on Sakura's coffee table. The two women eyed the small turquoise contraption and debated on what to do. Sakura was the first one to decide by ignoring the phone and focusing on the television. Ino grabbed the strap with her toes and flicked the phone towards herself, flipping it open with one hand. Oh, what the hell, she groaned. Sakura glanced her way, pink eyebrow raised in question at her distress. Ino ignored the third degree from her friend and pressed the talk button. What do you want? The disdain in her voice was evident and Sakura instantly knew who was at the end of the line. There was only one man on this planet that could instantly irritate her, Shikamaru. She couldn't help but snicker openly at the other woman who shot her a glare that could kill. Sakura instantly stilled, stopped chewing, dropped one of the chopsticks and gulped. Ino was a frightening woman at times and she could sense that this was one of these moments. What? Sakura could hear the male voice stutter at the other end of the line. The words weren't very clear, but she got the gist of it. He was asking something impossible again, by the way Ino's knuckles were cracking. The blonde stood up from the couch and walked out towards the kitchen. I said, Shikamaru pressed his finger against the bridge of his nose, irritated. This woman really got under his skin. I'm in a tight spot and I need your help with something that is going to set fire to Konoha and destroy Naruto. Bullshit, Ino said very sweetly, enough to make Kankuro gulp nervously. The sound was loud enough to make her aware of him on the line. Well, if it isn't my old pal the puppet master. Yo. The line crackled with the strange echo that told her he was still in Japan. Must be serious if you brought in the cavalry, she commented dryly as she leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. She peeked around the door frame and spied Sakura completely engrossed with Wheel of Fortune. Yeah, it seems that there's someone stirring up shit with the Konoha government and trying to make our dear leader look like a sack of shit. Shikamaru leaned back against his chair and looked up at the ceiling. Someone's trying to make Tsunade look bad. Ino almost laughed. Who could possibly, White Snake? Kankuro cut her off. The two words sent a chill down her spine. Okay, she took a calming breath. Okay, you got my attention. Sorry. I have to go to a lunch meeting with a new client. Naruto sighed dramatically. He pressed the palm of both his hands against the temple of his head and completely seemed dejected. It's fine, Naruto. Hinata was trying to sit up with a little bit of dignity she managed to scrape off the couch. He turned his head slightly towards her, catching a glimpse of her disheveled state and he pressed his lips together. That's really dangerous. There was a strangled sound coming from her lover and she glanced his way. Her eyes widened a fraction before she saw him move as though he'd teleported himself from one area of space to the next. Naruto, she squealed under the fresh attack of kisses. His busy fingers found the edge of her bra once again and she laughed, his hair tickling her nose. Where were we? He mumbled while his lips sought the flesh of her breasts. His fingertips brushed the material and he heard her suck in a small breath. I think we were right about. The phone vibrated again, sending a jolt of irritation through both Hinata and Naruto. He didn't bother getting up off his lover and simply flipped the phone open and let his most angry growl spit through his teeth. "I'm fucking coming, quit blueballing me." "Shit." Hinata debated between reprimanding Naruto's colorful language or agreeing wholeheartedly with Naruto's reaction to Kiba's annoying interruptions. "Sakura, I have to hit the office, I'll be back in a while." Before her friend could question why she was leaving, Ino had already slammed the door of her apartment shut and was 3/4 the way down the stairs. In Ino's world, there was only one unforgivable sin: threatening or harming her friends. White Snake had just crossed that line. If what Shikamaru had said was true, then it wasn't just Naruto or Tsunade that was about to be dragged through the mud. Hyuga corporations had their hands dirty in this mess as well. The drive from Sakura's to the office was thankfully quick, and her mind had gone into overdrive the second she sat in her car and turned the key to make the engine rumble with life. There was a few things about Yamanaka Ino that even Sakura wasn't aware of. Her past was something she didn't really reveal to anyone, considering it was a heavily involved with criminal activity, no thanks to Shikamaru. She stepped out of her car and quickly made her way through the employee-only stairway. Her eyes lingered on the company's name as she pulled the door open, making her smirk. "The all-seeing eyes of the Hyuga indeed," she mused. Her mind wandered to a memory as she climbed the stairs. It was something she would never forget. The previous president of the company had truly taken the motto to heart. She could still remember her first day at Hyuga Corporation, walking into that huge office and sitting across the desk from the imposing figure of the white-eyed man. What had floored her was being told, point blank, that he was well aware of her past indiscretions before asking what she intended to do as a member of his company. She remembered staring open-mouthed at the man for almost a full minute before she was able to find her voice to answer. Ino had profusely reassured Hayashi that those days were behind her, only to be thrown for another loop when he carefully hinted at the notion that she was not to retire. She greeted the few workers that passed her as she made her way to her office. She reached over and pulled her keys from her purse. Before reaching the door, she quickly glanced around before letting herself in. There, in the corner of the small space, stood an unassuming wooden light stand. It didn't attract attention, and it was decrepit-looking enough that no one would even think of taking it out of her office. Office supply rats were the worst. Sparing a glance towards the doorway, she quickly unlocked the cabinet underneath the stand, opened the door, and turned on the computer hidden within before closing and locking the compartment again. The blonde kept her usual cheery expression in place as she casually closed her door and returned to her desk. Seated once more, Ino's expression turned serious as she reached under her desk and depressed a hidden button, causing her computer monitor to change to the whitey text and black background command line of the hidden computer. She quickly, yet reluctantly, connected to her ex-partner's server and began her infiltration of White Snake's systems. Shikamaru had given her very simple, straightforward instructions: get in, find out when they were planning to start their attack on Tsunade or Naruto, and get the hell out. If for some reason she was discovered, she was to completely screw up their terminals and keep them shut down while the puppet master and lazy ass swiped all the data. It was easy as pie, as some would say, for the legendary hacker mind switch. As she ran into the heavy security measures of the server, she let her subconscious take over the hack. She used the template that Shikamaru had provided to wiggle her way past the security algorithms in place while noting any variations she found for future reference. Ino shook her head as she returned to the past in her mind. Hayashi apparently knew of her and her teammates and hoped to get all three to help him protect his network. Information had been repeatedly leaked to their competitors and he wanted it plugged. Kankuro and Shikamaru had opted out of helping, but she and Chuji still pulled it off on their own without alerting anyone that they were even looking. It had taken her almost 6 months to track down the source, but she'd caught the 5 idiots responsible and earned the co-editor position. After that, it had only been a matter of time before she proved her skill to everyone and earned herself the position of editor. A position that, thankfully, rated its own private office. Yes, life was good. So good, in fact, that she almost didn't realize that she'd infiltrated successfully into one of the unused terminals attached to the enemy mainframe. After doing a small jig in her chair, she switched back over to her work computer and sent her team a colorful "mission complete" with her own personal flourishes. Shikamaru's inbox chime caught his attention. "Sending you the notes on them, right?" Shikamaru heard the click of a mouse over the line. "Now." The lazy tech just shook his head at the time lag between the phones before opening the email. "Got it right here." He opened the folder and read the names of the files inside: Spider Spit, Death Flute, the Khan Siamese Twins, Bulldozer, and Bones. "So who are they?" Shikamaru could hear the sound of Kenkuro typing rapidly over the phone as he responded. "They're a group of hackers that go by the name of Sound 5. Well, really, Sound 4 now that Bones is dead." Even more typing and a few clicks could be heard as he continued. Shikamaru browsed through the data he'd been sent and gave a long, low whistle. The notes that Kenkuro's contact in the Internet Crimes Task Force had so kindly shared with them contained detailed graphs, saved chat conversations, a color-coded map with confirmed and suspected attacks, photographs and criminal records on each member of the group. Shikamaru zoomed in on one of the culprits and instantly recognized her from that morning. She was the loud mouth that was threatening Kiba in the lobby. So it really was them. He shook his head in disbelief. If half of what was in these files was true, then Kenkuro's contact had just handed him White Snake on a platter right out of the starting gate. That made Shikamaru a very happy man. Another chime caught his attention. Ino had good news for him, too. She was in and she hadn't been detected from what she could tell. She had taken over the enemy system as flawlessly as ever. The Ino avatar at the bottom of the message flipping two birds was ignored by both men as standard procedure. "Fuck, she's fast," Kenkuro praised at the other end of the phone while Shikamaru nodded in agreement. Ino was very dangerous. Shikamaru hung up his phone and engrossed himself in the data he'd been sent. To say that Kiba was uncomfortable was putting it mildly. There was no real way to properly express his strong dislike of the man that stood before him. There were several factors. It was the fact that the meeting room was small, overcrowded, and full of stinks and sticky substances that he didn't care to identify. Its claustrophobic darkness accented with the vials of dark inks wasn't helping with his discomfort any either, but without a doubt, Sai was the focal point or the unpleasantness. Now, the reason he was standing here, instead of Naruto as originally planned, was somewhat of a mystery to him. Naruto had been late for a meeting between himself and a new client, so he had persistently tried to get in touch with the man via the cell phone to no avail. So he used the emergency number, only to be deafened by a highly irate Naruto. "Son of a bitch, I had it unbuttoned." The muttering was like a curse when he had Kiba in his car. The evil glare he kept sending his way had him really openly repenting for whatever he had done wrong. So, Naruto had the brilliant idea to send him here as a punishment. He really hated him. Truly, with a great passion rivaled only by the love for his dog. Naruto's assistant fidgeted. His memory surrounding Sai over several years was enough to traumatize any sane heterosexual male. Any psychologist would certainly get their money's worth of problems if they ever managed to get this ghost out of the office and into the sun, although he could potentially burst into flames once the rays touched his skin. Not that he was insinuating that Sai was a vampire. No. He wasn't suggesting that the man was a source of evil or the undead by any means. It was more like he was one of the Dungeon and Dragon twerps who never outgrew the phase in high school and still played it 24/7 in their parents' basements. He certainly carried the look: small black beady eyes, ghastly pale white skin, hair so black you didn't know if it was clean or dirty. At least he didn't smell. Kiba scrunched up his face in disgust as he recalled the first time Naruto introduced him to the private staff member. Why Naruto still asked this man to work for him was beyond any plausible sane rationality he could justify. So, he had stopped trying to decipher Naruto's lack of logic years ago. "What can I do for you?" Sai's voice sent chills down his back. His eyes were focused below the belt, making Kiba fidget again. I have all the drafts from Naruto, he wants them done up as soon as possible so he can start designing. He squinted his eyes, trying to ignore the sudden drop of comfort in the room. I'll get them ready. Sai leaned over his desk, grabbed the rolled-up drafts from Kiba and smirked, letting his gaze linger uncomfortably on the man standing before him. He couldn't resist. If you want them today, all you got to do is let me draw your fuck no. Kiba almost twitched violently before twirling on the ball of his feet and quickly walked out the door, ignoring Sai's chuckle. Kabuto had some excellent news, according to the message just emailed to him. Orochimaru grinned, licked his lips in anticipation as he waited for his assistants to arrive for a meeting that would change the little fantasy work Tsunade had achieved. Soon, she would be brought down by her own weaknesses and he would be there to pick up all the pieces that fell to the ground, claiming what was rightfully his. It didn't hurt, either, that his nemesis's son in the landscaping business was going to be brought down in a glorious blaze of fire that would destroy the name Uzumaki to the core of its existence. Yes, a glorious day indeed. He muttered before he heard a soft knock at his door.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.